Everyone knows the story. In 1519, a Spanish soldier named Hernán Cortés landed on the shores of Mexico with 500 men, a handful of cannons and 16 horses. 2 years later, one of the mightiest empires in the Western Hemisphere lay in ruins. For 5 centuries, this has been called the Conquest, a story of European steel and gunpowder triumphing over stone and obsidian, a story of one civilization crushing another. But that story is wrong, not slightly wrong. Fundamentally, structurally wrong, because here is what the textbooks rarely tell you. When Tenochtitlan, the great island capital of the Aztec Empire, finally fell in August of 1521, there were fewer than 900 Spanish soldiers involved in the siege. There were also over 200,000 indigenous warriors. The Aztec Empire was not conquered by Spain, it was dismantled by its own neighbors. By peoples it had dominated, humiliated, and bled for generations. By tributary states who had watched their young men dragged to Aztec temples and never come back. By a city-state that had been surrounded on all sides for decades and had refused against every conceivable odd to surrender. The empire that ruled central Mexico for nearly a century was not brought low by outsiders, it was destroyed from within. By the alliances it had made, and far more fatally by the enemies it had chosen not to finish. This is that story. To understand how the Aztec Empire fell, you first have to understand what it actually was. Most people picture the Aztecs as a single unified civilization, ruled by a god-emperor from a golden throne. The reality was far more complicated and far more fragile. In the year 1428, 3 city-states entered into a formal military and political agreement, Tenochtitlan, built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco. Texcoco, an ancient and culturally sophisticated city on the eastern shore of the same lake, and Tlacopan, a smaller but strategically vital partner on the western shore. Together, these 3 formed what they called the Excan-Tlahtoloyan, the Triple Alliance. In the decades that followed, this alliance expanded through a combination of military conquest and political pressure. City after city, kingdom after kingdom fell under their control. By the early 16th century, the Triple Alliance dominated a territory of roughly 125,000 square miles and extracted tribute from somewhere between 5 and 6 million people. But here is the critical thing to understand about how this empire worked. The Triple Alliance did not, for the most part, replace local rulers. It did not garrison its conquered territories with permanent armies. It did not impose a single language or religion or bureaucratic system across its holdings. What it did was far simpler and far more resented. It demanded payment. Every tributary city sent a regular flow of goods to Tenochtitlan and its partners. Cotton cloth, cacao feathers, gold dust, rubber, jade, copper bells, food. And something far darker, human beings, to be used in the ritual sacrifices that the Aztec cosmology demanded with increasing regularity. For the peoples who paid, this was not an abstraction. This was your harvest leaving on the backs of porters. This was your neighbors being marched away. This was the knowledge that your city existed at the pleasure of a power you could not defy and could never fully appease. And the empire knew this. It was designed to be known. The architects of Aztec expansion, particularly a man named Tlaxcalal, the great political mind behind the early empire, understood that fear was infrastructure, that the spectacle of power was as important as power itself. The great sacrificial ceremonies at Tenochtitlan, the towering temples visible for miles across the lake, the skull racks at Tzompantli displaying thousands of offerings to the gods. These were not just religious acts, they were messages. We are beyond your reach. We are beyond your comprehension. Bend or be consumed. For a time, this strategy worked brilliantly, but it had one catastrophic design flaw. It manufactured enemies. Everywhere, constantly, without exception. Every tribute demand was a grievance carefully preserved. Every sacrifice was a family that remembered. Every humiliation was a debt that accumulated interest in silence, waiting for a moment that might never come, but that, when it did, would be paid back with absolute precision. The Aztec Empire was, in this sense, a machine that ran on other people's suffering. And machines that run on suffering have a way of eventually running out of fuel. The city that would not fall, of all the enemies the Triple Alliance had made, none was more dangerous than the Tlaxcalans. Tlaxcala was a confederation of city-states, 4 primary altepetl, or sovereign communities located about 60 miles east of Tenochtitlan. They were culturally similar to the Aztecs in many ways, speaking the same language and sharing many of the same religious traditions. But politically, They were the empire's most stubborn and persistent adversary. For reasons that historians still debate, the Triple Alliance never conquered Tlaxcala. Some believe they tried and simply could not. Others argue that the wars between Aztec and Tlaxcalan forces were deliberately kept ongoing, that the so-called Flower Wars, the ritual conflicts fought with the explicit purpose of capturing enemies for sacrifice rather than killing them outright, were a mechanism for maintaining a controllable, nearby source of sacrificial captives. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. For decades, the Tlaxcalans and the Aztecs fought. For decades, the Tlaxcalans were surrounded on virtually all sides by Aztec-allied territory, cut off from coastal trade, denied access to salt and cotton, and all the goods that flowed through Aztec-controlled markets. They endured. Bitter, defiant, and increasingly expert in the art of fighting an enemy that vastly outnumbered them. When the moment came, they would be ready. Others argue that the wars between Aztec and Tlaxcalan forces were deliberately kept ongoing, that the so-called Flower Wars, the ritual conflicts fought with the explicit purpose of capturing enemies for sacrifice rather than killing them outright, were a mechanism for maintaining a controllable, nearby source of sacrificial captives. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. For decades, the Tlaxcalans and the Aztecs fought. For decades, the Tlaxcalans were surrounded on virtually all sides by Aztec-allied territory, cut off from coastal trade, denied access to salt and cotton, and all the goods that flowed through Aztec-controlled markets. They endured. Bitter, defiant, and increasingly expert in the art of fighting an enemy that vastly outnumbered them. When the moment came, they would be ready. While the Tlaxcalans endured their isolation, something equally dangerous was happening inside the Triple Alliance itself. In 1516, the ruler of Texcoco died. His name was Nezahualpilli, and he was one of the most respected figures in central Mexico, a poet, a philosopher, a man whose court was considered the intellectual center of the Aztec world. His death created an immediate and devastating problem. He had not designated a clear successor. Into this vacuum stepped two rivals. On one side, Cacama, the candidate supported by the Mexica ruler of Tenochtitlan, the man history would come to know as Montezuma II. On the other side, Ixtlilxochitl Cacama's half-brother, who believed the throne of Texcoco was rightfully his, and who had no intention of being sidelined by his larger, more powerful neighbor. What followed was, in effect, a civil war within one of the three pillars of the empire. Ixtlilxochitl took control of the northern provinces of Texcoco. He held them, and he waited, nursing a fury that, once it found an outlet, would help tear down everything his father had helped build. At the center of all this sat Montezuma II. He is often depicted in popular history as passive, confused, perhaps even paralyzed by prophecy, a leader who mistook Cortés for the returning god, Quetzalcoatl, and simply surrendered his empire in a kind of religious stupor. This is almost certainly a myth, constructed largely after the fact. Montezuma was, by all accounts, a formidable and ruthless ruler who had expanded the empire further than any of his predecessors, and who was deeply aware of the threats surrounding him. What he was not was lucky. He inherited a system already groaning under its own weight, a machine of tribute and terror that required ever more fuel, tributary peoples pushed to their limits, a divided Texcoco, a Tlaxcala that had survived everything the empire threw at it, and somewhere beyond the eastern horizon, persistent rumors of strangers arriving by sea in vast winged canoes. He was about to run out of time. Hernán Cortés arrived on the Mexican coast in April of 1519. He was 34 years old, a trained lawyer who had never commanded a military expedition, in charge of a force that his own governor had tried to recall before it departed. He had 11 ships, 508 soldiers, 16 horses, and a handful of small artillery pieces. By the standards of what he was about to attempt, these were laughably inadequate resources. But Cortés had something no amount of soldiers or cannon could substitute for. He was a ferociously perceptive reader of political situations. Within weeks of landing, he had done something that would ultimately decide the fate of an empire. He had started asking questions. He asked the coastal peoples, the Totonacs, the Sempoalans, about Tenochtitlan, about the tribute system, about who resented it, about who might be willing to help a group of armed outsiders make their way to the interior. The answers he received were, to put it mildly, encouraging. Everywhere he went, he found people who despised the Aztec tribute collectors. People who lived in fear of the sacrificial demands that arrived each season, like an invoice for continuing to exist. People who, for the first time in decades, were being offered something extraordinary: the possibility that the power which had defined and constrained their lives might not be permanent. He was not offering freedom, exactly. He was offering a different master. But for people who had spent a generation grinding under the heel of Tenochtitlan, that was enough. There was one more thing he needed. One piece of the puzzle without which none of what followed would have been possible. Her name, before the Spanish gave her theirs, was Malinali. She was somewhere between 15 and 20 years old when she came into Cortés's possession as part of a group of enslaved women offered by the defeated Tlaxcalans. Her early life is reconstructed largely from fragments. She was likely born into a noble family somewhere in the Gulf Coast region. At some point, possibly after her father died, and her mother remarried, she was sold into slavery and passed through several owners before ending up among the Tlaxcalans. In the process, she had acquired something extraordinarily valuable: fluency in both Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and the Mayan dialects of the coast. Cortés recognized immediately what this meant. A Spanish soldier named Jerónimo de Aguilar had been shipwrecked on the Yucatan coast years earlier and spoke Mayan. Malinali spoke Mayan and Nahuatl. Between them, Cortés suddenly had a translation chain that reached all the way to Tenochtitlan. History has treated her with remarkable cruelty. In Mexico, she became and in many ways remains a symbol of betrayal. La Malinche, the woman who gave the conquerors the words they needed. The traitor to her people. But this framing requires a series of assumptions that fall apart under examination. She had no homeland she had not already been expelled from. The Aztec Empire was not her empire. It was the empire that had taken everything from the peoples among whom she had lived. And in the world as she found it, survival had always meant adaptation. Whatever her motivations, her role in what followed was irreplaceable. She was not merely a translator. She was a cultural interpreter, a diplomatic intermediary, an intelligence source of the highest order. She understood not just what people were saying, but what they meant. She understood the protocols that had to be followed, the pride that could not be touched, the grievances that could be weaponized. When Cortés finally sat down with the Tlaxcalans, she was beside him. And what happened in that meeting changed everything. Tlaxcalans did not simply welcome Cortés. First, they fought him. In September of 1519, the Tlaxcalan Confederation engaged the Spanish force in a series of battles that lasted nearly 3 weeks. They brought tens of thousands of warriors. The Spanish suffered significant casualties. The outcome at several moments was genuinely uncertain. But the Spanish had something the Tlaxcalans had never encountered: steel swords, which cut through the cotton armor of Mesoamerican warfare with brutal efficiency. Horses, which had never existed in the Americas, and which caused genuine panic in the initial encounters. And firearms, whose noise and smoke were as psychologically disorienting as their physical effects. After 3 weeks of fighting, the Tlaxcalans made a decision that would be debated for the next 500 years. They offered peace, not surrender, not submission. Peace and an alliance. The terms, as the Tlaxcalans understood them, were straightforward: help these strangers reach Tenochtitlan and, in the process, destroy the empire that had spent decades humiliating and strangling them. Their leader at the time, a man named Xicotencatl the Elder, reportedly made an eloquent speech to his council about the nature of the choice before them. The strangers were powerful and strange. The outcome was uncertain, but the status quo encirclement, tribute warfare, isolation was a slow death. The strangers offered something else. They accepted. The alliance between Cortés and Tlaxcala was not a minor diplomatic footnote. It was the pivotal event of the conquest. It gave Cortés not just soldiers but legitimacy, a political structure to attach to, an intelligence network, supply lines, and an argument he could make to every other resentful tributary along his path. Look, the Tlaxcalans joined us. If they can, you can. By the time Cortés marched toward Tenochtitlan in October of 1519, he was not leading a Spanish expedition. He was leading a coalition, and it was growing. When the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies entered Tenochtitlan on November 8, 1519, even the hardened soldiers among them fell into something approaching speechlessness. Tenochtitlan was not a primitive settlement. It was a metropolis, built on an island in the middle of a high-altitude lake, connected to the mainland by vast causeways, wide enough for 10 men to walk abreast. The city held somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 inhabitants, making it, at the time, larger than any city in Europe, except possibly Constantinople. The markets were staggering. One Spanish soldier, Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who wrote his memoirs decades later, described standing in the great market of Tlatelolco and being unable to see to the far end of it. Every product imaginable, organized by category, governed by judges who settled disputes on the spot. Cacao, cloth, gold, rubber, animals, medicines, food from across the continent, and at the center of it all, the twin temples of the Great Pyramid rising above the rooftops, visible from miles away across the lake. Montezuma met them personally. He was carried on a litter, his feet not permitted to touch the ground. His court was elaborate beyond what most Spanish observers had the vocabulary to describe. What happened next was one of the most audacious acts in the history of military strategy. Cortés arrested him. Within a week of arriving as a guest, Cortés effectively took the ruler of the most powerful empire in the Western Hemisphere hostage, moving him to the Spanish quarters under what was euphemistically described as protective custody. Montezuma, for reasons that historians still debate whether from genuine political calculation, shock, or some recognition of the impossible position he was in, did not immediately resist. And with that, the slow implosion began. For months, the situation held in a bizarre, fragile equilibrium. Cortés ruled through Montezuma. Montezuma cooperated in ways that ranged from pragmatic to inexplicable. The Spanish extracted enormous quantities of gold and silver from the royal treasury. The population of Tenochtitlan watched and waited. Then, in late April of 1520, Cortés was forced to leave. A rival Spanish expedition had landed on the coast, sent by the governor of Cuba to arrest him. Cortés took most of his force to deal with it, which he did, with characteristic ruthlessness, eventually convincing most of the rival soldiers to join him, and left a garrison in Tenochtitlan under the command of Pedro de Alvarado. Alvarado was brave, effective in battle, and possessed of a paranoia and brutality that in quieter circumstances might have been merely unpleasant. In the powder-keg political environment of occupied Tenochtitlan, they proved catastrophic. In May of 1520, during the festival of Tlaxcala, one of the most important religious ceremonies in the Aztec calendar, in which hundreds of nobles gathered in the courtyard of the great temple, Alvarado ordered an attack. His justification was that he had received intelligence of a planned uprising. Whether this was true, fabricated, or simply a fear mistaken for fact, the outcome was the same. Spanish soldiers sealed the courtyard exits and moved through the densely packed crowd of unarmed or ceremonially armed nobles with weapons drawn. The massacre lasted hours. Hundreds were killed, possibly over 1,000. The courtyard ran with blood. When the survivors managed to escape, they ran through the streets of Tenochtitlan, spreading word of what had happened. The city erupted. When Cortés returned to find the situation irretrievably lost, the Spanish garrison besieged, food and water cut off, the population beyond negotiation, he attempted one last gamble. He brought Montezuma to the roof of the building where he was being held and asked him to address his people. What exactly happened next is disputed. Some accounts say the crowd threw stones and other projectiles. Others say arrows were fired. Montezuma was injured. Several days later, he was dead. The Spanish said he died of his wounds. Many Aztecs believed, then and afterward, that the Spanish killed him when he was no longer useful. The empire was now in open war with its uninvited guests. On the night of June 30, 1520, a night that would be remembered as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, Cortés attempted to evacuate his force from Tenochtitlan across the causeways in darkness. The Aztecs were waiting. The fighting on the causeways was catastrophic. The Spanish and their allies were cut off, surrounded, driven into the water. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of soldiers drowned, weighed down by the gold they had been carrying. Horses were lost. Cannons were lost. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 400 and 800 Spanish soldiers died that night. Along with thousands of Tlaxcalan allies, Cortés reportedly sat under a tree at the end of the night and wept. Then he stood up and he began to plan. He retreated to Tlaxcala, the Tlaxcalans, who had just suffered enormous casualties fighting alongside him, who had every rational reason to reconsider whether this alliance was worth continuing, received him. They fed his army. They provided reinforcements. They helped him rebuild. Why? Because for the Tlaxcalans, this was never about Cortés. It was about the empire that had surrounded them for decades. The Noche Triste was a setback, but the goal, the destruction of Aztec power, had not changed. And Cortés, whatever his other qualities, was still the most effective weapon they had ever had access to. While Cortés regrouped, something was happening inside Tenochtitlan that would ultimately seal its fate more completely than any battle. Smallpox, the disease, had arrived on the ships, carried by a slave in the expedition Cortés had defeated on the coast. It moved through the indigenous population with horrifying efficiency. Communities with no prior exposure, no accumulated immunity, no framework for understanding what was happening to them, died in numbers almost impossible to comprehend. Tenochtitlan was devastated. Among the dead was Cuitlahuac, the new ruler, who had organized the successful defense of the Noche Triste, and who, by all accounts, was a formidable leader. He died of smallpox approximately 80 days after taking power. His successor was a young man named Cuauhtemoc. He was brave, clear-eyed, and almost certainly knew, as he took the throne, that he was inheriting a city that was dying. Beyond the walls of Tenochtitlan, the coalition against it continued to grow. This is the part of the story that the traditional conquest narrative almost completely erases. When Cortés launched his final campaign against Tenochtitlan in December of 1520 and January of 1521, his force included somewhere between 700 and 900 Spanish soldiers. His indigenous allies numbered, by some estimates, over 200,000. Among them were the Tlaxcalans, who had been the core of his support from the beginning. But also, and this is where the internal fault lines of the Triple Alliance finally split completely, the Texcocans, Ixtlilxochitl, who had spent years fighting for control of Texcoco against the Mexica-backed Cacama, who had watched his own half-brother serve as an instrument of Tenochtitlan's political will, made his choice. He allied with Cortés. He brought warriors. He provided the eastern shore of Lake Texcoco as a staging ground for the final offensive. One of the three cities of the Triple Alliance had turned against the other two. Cortés understood that Tenochtitlan's greatest strength was also, potentially, its greatest vulnerability. It was an island city, connected to the mainland by causeways that could be, and had been demonstrated to be ferociously defensible, supplied by canoe traffic across the lake. As long as the lake remained accessible to Aztec forces, the city could hold indefinitely. He ordered the construction of 13 brigantines, shallow draft wooden warships suitable for lake warfare. They were built in sections in Tlaxcala, carried over the mountains in pieces, and assembled at the lakeshore. In May of 1521, the siege began. The brigantines controlled the lake. The causeways were blockaded. Cortés and his indigenous allies pushed in from multiple directions simultaneously along the three main causeways: the Tacuba Causeway from the west, the Iztapalapa Causeway from the south, the Tepeyac Causeway from the north. What followed was not a quick or clean victory. It was 75 days grinding, brutal urban combat. The Aztec defenders fought with everything they had. They flooded sections of the causeways to prevent the brigantines from flanking them. They dug up the paving stones to create obstacles. They rebuilt each night what the attackers had torn down during the day. Cuauhtemoc was, by all accounts, an extraordinary military leader. He adapted, he refused to surrender. He understood that capitulation meant the end of everything, not just his rule, but the civilization he represented. At one point, Cortés was nearly captured during fighting in the causeway. He was pulled back from the edge by his own soldiers. But the mathematics were relentless. The city was cut off from food. The lake water, normally fresh, had been contaminated. Disease was already present in the population. The Allies, pressing in on all sides, numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Sector by sector, the city fell not with ease but with the slow, terrible certainty of a tide coming in. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtemoc attempted to escape across the lake by canoe. He was intercepted by one of the brigantines. When they brought him before Cortés, he reportedly pointed to the Spanish captain's dagger and said, "Use it on me." Cortés did not that day. 2 years later, on a march through the jungle, Cortés had him hanged. Behind him, where Tenochtitlan had stood, there was silence and rubble and the beginning of what would eventually become Mexico City. The greatest city in the Western Hemisphere had been reduced to ruins in 75 days. It is worth sitting with what actually happened here. An empire that had taken nearly a century to build was dismantled in 2 years by a coalition in which European soldiers were, numerically, an afterthought. The Tlaxcalans alone contributed more fighting force to the destruction of Tenochtitlan than all the Spanish soldiers in Mexico combined. The Texcocans, the Totonacs, the peoples of Huexotzinco, the dozens of tributary communities who saw in the chaos of 1519 and 1520 a chance to settle decades of accumulated grievances, these were the instruments of the empire's destruction. They were instruments the Aztecs had, over the course of nearly a century, manufactured themselves. Every tribute demand had sharpened a blade. Every sacrifice had hardened a resolve. Every humiliation had added another name to a list that, when the moment finally came, proved to be impossibly long. The Triple Alliance fell because of what the Triple Alliance had done, not to outsiders, to neighbors, to peoples it had decided to dominate rather than absorb, to tax rather than incorporate, to terrify rather than trust. The lesson is not a comfortable one, because it applies far beyond the Valley of Mexico in the 16th century. It is a lesson about the brittleness of power built on fear, about the long memory of the oppressed, about how empires that treat their subjects as resources, rather than people eventually discover that resources, when given a choice, choose otherwise. Tenochtitlan was the most beautiful city in the world. By the testimony of the men who destroyed it, it is gone. And the alliance that built it was dismantled not by the strangers who arrived from across the ocean, but by the people it had spent a century teaching to hate it. History has a way of collecting its debts. Crown and Ruin explores the rises and falls that shaped the world we inherited. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more empires ahead, more alliances waiting to fracture, more mornings that felt like the beginning of something and turned out to be the end. The next one is coming soon.